June 3rd, 1965. Edward White had been outside the Gemini 4 capsule for about 20 minutes. He was the first American to ever walk in space. And by all accounts, he was having the time of his life. He was floating freely above the Earth, 160 miles up, tethered to the capsule by a thin gold cord, using a small handheld thruster to move himself around. He later described it as the most comfortable and natural feeling he had ever experienced. He didn't want to come back in. Mission Control told him it was time. He said no, not aggressively. He just wasn't ready. He floated there a little longer, looking down at the Pacific Ocean, rotating slowly in the silence. Commander James McDivitt told him again, more firmly this time. White finally said quietly, "It's the saddest moment of my life." He came back in. The hatch sealed. Gemini 4 completed its mission and splashed down safely 4 days later. But what almost nobody talks about is what would have happened if that hatch hadn't sealed. The mechanism was manual, difficult to operate in a pressurized suit, and had already shown resistance during the exit. If it had failed to close, if White had been unable to get back inside, McDivitt would have faced an impossible choice with no good options, and White would have remained outside, tethered, as the oxygen in his suit ran out somewhere over the Pacific. He survived. But the margin was smaller than the celebration suggested, and that was one of the luckier ones. Let's go through 3 of the most interesting incidents in human history. This is every time space almost ended an astronaut's life. On April 13th, 1970, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes were about 330,000 kilometers from Earth, roughly 56 hours into the Apollo 13 mission on their way to the moon. Swigert had just performed a routine stir of the oxygen tanks, a standard procedure done dozens of times on previous missions designed to prevent the liquid oxygen from settling unevenly. It took seconds. It was the kind of task that doesn't make it into the highlight reels. Then a bang. Not a small one. The kind that fills a spacecraft. The kind that means something has gone very wrong very fast. An oxygen tank in the service module had ruptured. Within minutes, it became clear that the second tank was failing too. The fuel cells that powered the command module ran on oxygen. Without oxygen, there was no power. Without power, there was no heat, no navigation, no way home. Lovell looked out the window and saw gas venting into space from the side of the spacecraft, and understood immediately what that meant. He had been an astronaut for years. He had trained for emergencies, but nothing quite prepares you for floating 330,000 kilometers from Earth, watching your spacecraft bleed out into space, knowing that the numbers are not in your favor. The 3 of them moved into the lunar module, a small craft designed for 2 people for 2 days, and used it as a lifeboat for 4 days. The temperature inside dropped to around 4 degrees Celsius. They rationed water so severely that Hayes developed a kidney infection from dehydration. They had to perform a navigation correction by manually aligning the spacecraft using only the Earth as a reference point, because most of their instruments were off to save power. Lovell had not slept in what felt like days. Hayes was running a fever. Swigert, the one who had stirred the tank, later said he spent the entire journey home wondering if it was his fault. They made it back, all 3 of them. The re-entry capsule had enough power left for exactly what it needed, and no more. They splashed down in the Pacific on April 17th, 4 days after the tank ruptured, having spent the entirety of that time doing the cold math of survival in a spacecraft that was never designed to keep them alive in this situation. Lovell never went to space again. He had been scheduled to walk on the moon. He never did. What Apollo 13 had that most space emergencies don't is time. Time to think, to communicate, to problem solve with an entire team of engineers on the ground working through the night. What the Columbia shuttle had in 2003 was almost none of that. February 1st, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia was 16 minutes from landing. The crew of 7, Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, Ilan Ramon, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, and Laurel Clark had been in space for 16 days conducting scientific experiments. They were coming home. Husband, the commander, had spoken to his family the night before. Clark had sent an email to friends describing the view of Earth from orbit and saying she wished they could all see it. What nobody on board knew, what NASA knew but had concluded was not a serious risk, was that during launch, a piece of foam insulation had broken off the external tank and struck the leading edge of Columbia's left wing. The impact had damaged the heat shield tiles in a way that wouldn't matter at all in orbit, but would matter enormously during re-entry, when the shuttle would encounter temperatures of up to 1,600 degrees Celsius as it hit the atmosphere. During re-entry, superheated plasma entered the damaged section of the wing. The temperature sensors in the left wing began reading abnormally, and then stopped reading at all. The crew would have felt nothing unusual at first. Columbia was traveling at Mach 18, 23 times the speed of sound, and the first indication that something was wrong came from the outside. Observers on the ground watching the shuttle's descent saw it beginning to break apart in the sky over Texas. The crew did not survive. All 7 were lost. What makes Columbia particularly hard to sit with is the timeline of what was known and when. Engineers during the mission had raised concerns about the foam strike and requested satellite imagery of the wing to assess the damage. The request was denied on the basis that even if damage was confirmed, there was nothing that could be done about it. That decision has been examined and re-examined in the years since, and the honest answer is that it remains one of the most painful what-ifs in the history of spaceflight. There may have been options. A rescue mission was theoretically possible. The crew could potentially have sheltered on the International Space Station while a rescue was mounted. Whether any of it would have worked is something nobody can say for certain. What is certain is that Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, Ilan Ramon, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, and Laurel Clark went to space to do science, spent 16 days doing it, and did not come home. They were not abstractions or statistics. They were people with families who were waiting at the landing strip that morning. Clark's email about the view from orbit was sent less than 2 days before Columbia broke apart over Texas. She was right that it was a view worth sharing. She just didn't get to land. Space is not a forgiving environment. It never has been. Every person who has ever left Earth's atmosphere has done so, knowing, in some part of themselves, that the systems keeping them alive are extraordinarily complex, and that complexity is never without risk. The people in this video understood that better than almost anyone alive. They trained for it, prepared for it, and went anyway. They all deserve to be remembered as people who went somewhere almost no one has ever been for humanity's future, and gave everything they had to get there and back. Most of them made it, some of them didn't. And the ones who didn't made it possible, in ways that are hard to fully articulate for us.